There you're with the SENSE Centre for Satellite Data and Environmental Science, Centre for Doctoral Training, where we use satellite data to look at our changing environment, whether that's ice, land, oceans, or even atmospheres. And these are just some examples of some very beautiful satellite imagery, the kind of things that our PhD students work with. So for today's webinar, I'm doing a quick intro, then the panelists are going to answer some pre-prepared questions and also your questions. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A at any point. One of our SENSE directors, Professor Kathy Whaler, will be joining us at 3 to answer any more of your technical questions. So if I haven't answered your question straight away, it's because I think that Kathy might be able to give more insight into it than perhaps the panelists. So I just thought I would start with the basics, but when I say basic, it's not really basic. What is a PhD? Because I definitely didn't know really before I started applying. I just knew it was like the next step after masters if you wanted to stay in academia. So it's a Doctor of Philosophy and basically a research degree that usually takes between like 3, 4, or maybe upwards of 4 if you're me years. And you do research and you write a thesis and then you're assessed on your thesis, and at the end you get to call yourself a doctor. It's an opportunity to delve into an area of research that perhaps you've been interested in before, or step into a whole new branch. There are a few bits of terminology I just wanted to state at the start because I know I didn't know what these were when I started. So there are several different ways of finding funding for PhDs. There are things called Centres for Doctoral Training, which SENSE is, which focuses on providing specific training for their PhD students. And the CDTs and the DTPs often cover multiple universities. Doctoral training partnerships are similar to CDTs, but slightly different, as often they offer training from elsewhere rather than perhaps put it on themselves. You can be independently funded. So I was independently funded my PhD from a variety of sources, which meant that I didn't have the amount of training that our SENSE students do. And you can be self-funded, which means that you're paying for everything yourself, and it's a very difficult path to do it that way, unfortunately. So when we talk about funding, it's split into several different things. You have your stipend, which is what you actually live off, what you take home at the end of the day, and that's tax-free. You then have your research training support grant, your RTSG, which is what you use to pay for additional training and when you travel to conferences. You also have your fees that are paid to the university. So there's quite a lot of funding around, and it's important to know the different setups and what the different kind of groups bring. So a little quick background on what SENSE is. We specialise in Earth observation and advanced data techniques. We have 70 studentships, 20 new this year, that are based at Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh, University of Leeds, the National Oceanography Centre and the British Antarctic Survey. We're funded by the Natural Environment Research Council, University of Edinburgh and Leeds, at the UK Space Agency and industry partners. We have over 40 industry partners that provide case partnerships. I put a note here, case partnership is basically a training opportunity where you go work in an industry environment for 3 months at our programme, but it can be longer elsewhere. And these industry partners offer co-supervision and support, and also access to facilities for our students. So some of the unique things about SENSE is that the PhDs are funded for 3 years, 9 months. Often it's a 3.5-year cycle that things are funded for. It's focused on being cross-discipline and cross-institute supervision. So you'll notice that all of the projects jump between different institutions. You have strong engagement with the space technology sector, and all of our students, as I say, do the 3-month placement. We also have a really specifically designed training course, which includes 8 weeks in your first year, which is not a conventional for PhD programs. It's quite unique. And then there's additional training, including residentials in the 2nd to 4th year. And to give you an idea of like the breadth of the training that you get, you cover things from software carpentry to atmosphere to land surface, and everyone does all of the training. So you come out at the end of your PhD with well-rounded knowledge of Earth observation. So another thing about SENSE is that we very strongly advocate for cohort building. So there's Slack channels, we introduce everyone before they start. We have virtual and in real life socials now. And there's also mentoring going on. So there's regular meetings with center managers and also a buddy system. So you're paired up with someone in the cohort above you, or the 2 cohorts above you, or 3 cohorts at this point. And they're there to answer any of your questions you might have. We're also keen to encourage our students to explore other areas of interest, particularly outreach. So there's a program called SAT School, and if you check out the SENSE website, you'll see a bunch of outreach opportunities that our students have engaged in, including producing materials for secondary school lessons, origami, a satellite model, etc., etc. So quickly, the application process. The deadline for us is the 15th of January, so it's slightly later for us than a lot of PhD programs. After this, your application goes through selection, so it's read by SENSE Recruitment Committee, and they read the anonymized version of the application. When we say message the SENSE Recruitment email, that's only checked by the centre managers and myself, who have no impact on the recruitment committee at all. So if you have any questions and you're worried about asking them, please do ask it, because they won't be seen by people who are on the recruitment committee if you're worried about feeling silly or it negatively impacting your application. Step 3 is interviews, which tend to be held in early March, and then we'll make an offer shortly after the interview. As today is the applications webinar, I thought I'd just highlight a few things. So make sure you look through all the available projects at SENSE. You're only allowed to apply for 1 SENSE project. However, that doesn't mean you can't apply for projects at other DTPs, other training centres, independently funded PhDs, etc. It's very common to apply for multiple PhDs before you, when you're looking for them. We also ask for anonymised CVs and anonymised personal statements, and that means that it helps to remove unconscious bias of people reading the recruitment information. And there's a link to submit your application. I will share around these slides after the webinar is finished. And I just wanted to highlight that we have some drop-in sessions in early January. So for your last minute questions, you can just drop in and come sign up and talk to me, and hopefully I'll be able to help you. An important thing that SENSE is really proud of and commits a lot of time to is equality, diversity and inclusivity, so such as my role. And this year we're guaranteeing interview slots for up to 50% of our previous year's interview allocation for Black, Asian, minority ethnic and disabled applicants. And we're also offering one-to-one sessions with our centre managers or myself. So please do reach out if you fit in any of these categories, or even if you just want any extra support but aren't in one of those categories. So I'll stop sharing and then we'll move to the fun part of the panel. So now I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce yourselves. If you could introduce yourself, the university that you're at, the program that you're on, the kind of application process that you went to, and then your research area. And Dorothea, you're in my top left corner, so you're up first, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Dorothea Moser. I'm a 3rd-year PhD student at the British Antarctic Survey and in the SENSE DTP program that is based in Cambridge. I'm studying melt-affected ice cores for their informational value and how we can use it for climate reconstruction. It's not directly an Earth observation subject, that is remote sensing, but I think I'm bringing in the perspective of a different DTP. And if you have any specific questions about Cambridge and the SENSE application process, I'm here to help.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to pass to Sally because you are next.
Hi, I'm Sally Wilson. I'm a PhD student at the University of Leeds. I am on the Panorama DTP program, but I also have support from the SENSE CDT, so I do all of the SENSE training as well. So if you have any questions about applying for DTPs and CDTs, I can answer those and kind of the balance between the two. And my research is based in Antarctica. So I study ice speed in East Antarctica and how it's changing.
Great, thanks, Selley. Ross, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Ross. I'm a second year PhD student with the SENSE CDT. I'm based at the University of Leeds, and I study ice sheet ocean interactions in Antarctica, measuring the flow of the Antarctic ice sheet using satellite data.
Great, thank you. Kilian, you're up next.
Yeah, hello, I'm Kilian. I'm a first year PhD student with the SENSE CDT based in Leeds, specifically at the ICAS, the Institute for Climate and Atmospheric Sciences. And I research mineral dust, in particular dust storms, and how to use satellite imagery for input for generating shortest term forecasts of dust storms. And I came to Leeds as an international student. So if you have any questions about the process of application, if you're coming from abroad, I hope I can help you a little with that.
Amazing, thank you. And finally,
Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, I'm Liam. I'm also a first year SENSE CDT student, and I'm based in Edinburgh. So if you have any questions about Edinburgh at all and how it works with Edinburgh and Leeds being separate, feel free to come to me. And I'm studying mountain snow cover, trying to better understand the climate sensitivity of that, mainly focusing on mountains in Scotland to better predict how it's going to change in the future.
amazing, thank you. As you can see, there's quite a diversity of topics. There's quite a lot of ice cryosphere focus in the room, but that isn't the case for everyone in the SENSE CDT. It just happens to be who fancies being on the panel today. So we'll start with asking for the panel for their tips for finding a PhD. And everyone's looking for the hand up button. Brilliant, thank you, Dorothea. I saw yours first, so go ahead.
So I can recommend developing a project yourself, which is probably not the standard route, but I'm throwing it in there because that's the way I went for a PhD. I had a really interesting master's project, and certain questions couldn't be covered in that time frame. And then I spoke to my supervisor, and we came up with a project idea for a PhD. So that's an idea I can really recommend, because that way you can make sure that you actually really like the subject and that you have a say in what methods you want to apply and who you want to work with. So definitely a recommendation from my side.
That's a really good point. While the SENSE projects are already set out, there are many supervisors who are open to developing projects with you, and it's a great avenue, especially if you've got an interest already that you want to explore further. Thank you. Sally, you've moved to the top left of my screen, so I think you're next.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm always a big advocate for using Google. So if you Google findaphd.com or just Google PhDs and then whatever country you want to do a PhD in, or some kind of research buzzwords you can think of. So ice, cryosphere, satellites, for example, is what I Googled. Websites such as findaphd.com often have long lists of all the PhDs that are being advertised through different CDTs and DTPs, all collated together in one place, so they can be a really useful tool for kind of filtering.
Yeah, awesome, thank you. I keep forgetting, so some of us are in the same room and we're sharing the mic, so apologies if I accidentally mute people at the wrong time. Ross, you've got your hand up next.
Yeah, so I firstly second what Sally said about findaphd.com. I think it's a great website. But in addition, I think slightly a little bit more work. But I think following people that you're interested in on social media and university departments and research groups, quite often actually, for example, on Twitter, people might advertise PhD projects, and it kind of depends on the research community. Sort of with glaciology, lots of people are very active in social media, and so a lot of stuff gets posted, but that might not be the same in every sort of Earth observation field. And another thing is mailing lists. If there's a mailing list that you can find for sort of the topic they're interested in, quite often people will advertise PhD project there, sort of before they get advertised elsewhere as well. So it's a really useful resource.
Great, thank you. I'm going to stop trying to mute the room because we're all in it. Liam, you're next.
Awesome. I'm just going to third what I've said about Googling and using Find a PhD, especially if you're not exactly sure about the topic that you want to go into. It can be good filtering down and like narrowing down what you want to go into and finding what's out there. But also if you do know more specifically what you would like to do or you're interested in, or like you've had some experience during your master's or your undergrad about working with people or people in a certain field, it's worth going to them and chatting to them about because they know pretty much everyone in that field, so they're going to be able to send you to people who would know what PhDs are going to be available or what projects might be out there. So yeah, maybe go and try and chat to them too.
Great, thank you. Definitely worth reaching out to academics or perhaps students that you have connections with. For instance, if people on the panel have an interest similar to you. Most people are pretty friendly when you email them. Supervisors might not respond very quickly because their inboxes are very full, but students tend to have a bit more time potentially. You might argue with that. Kilian, over to you.
Well, I think I can only agree on what was said already. In particular, I think mailing lists can still be very helpful even beyond the PhD studies. For example, if you might think about a postdoc or even industry at some point. But for my case, I must say also talking to supervisors from your, for example, master's project can be very helpful because the world can be really small and people know each other, people know where to start a cooperation, for example, and I would really suggest doing that. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I think everyone starts with Google, it seems to be. But we are trying to make sure that our PhD projects reach a wider audience. So if there are any suggestions, don't be afraid to message me about what we can do to make it spread further. Next, how about we talk about the general PhD application process and how you approach that. So you found your PhDs on Find a PhD or social media, or you've messaged your potential supervisor. How did you go about sorting your application? Ross, over to you.
Yep. So I think, so as you said there, you find the project and then you message the supervisor. Definitely sort of the key first thing is to just have a chat with them, because having that conversation will help you decide whether the project is actually what you think it is, and whether that's what you're really interested in. And sort of you get an idea for the supervisor as well. It's a chance for the supervisor to meet you. And they'll also be able to sort of give you some guidance with the application process instead of sort of going in blind. Once you've had that conversation, not every PhD application is the same, but for example with SENSE, and I think some of the other CDTs and DPTs, you'll generally have to make a CV and then have a personal statement. So the personal statement, it's your chance to express why you're the right person for your project, and to sort of to expand on some of the things in your CV and add more detail and show why they're relevant. Because your CV is relatively short, it's only a couple of pages, and so there's not enough space in there to sort of really show some of the sort of finer details of what you've done. But the personal statement is a great way to sort of expand on that, and show why you're passionate about your project and why you're a good candidate. And then once you've submitted that, the deadlines for a lot of the NERC funded, or so the UKRI funded, so sort of UK government research project money, the deadlines are January, and then maybe a month later or so there'll be an interview stage, and you go for an interview then. But I'll let other people expand on that because I've spoken quite a lot.
No, great, thanks, Ross. Liam?
Yeah, just again, I think it's really worthwhile contacting the supervisor before you actually apply for any PhD you're looking at, just to clarify the projects, because often like you can't be necessarily completely clear from, maybe you don't fully understand what's been written online, and it's just good to chat about it and find out what really you would be doing. But also to meet that person like, obviously you're always trying to impress academics, but you kind of want to be impressed by them too. You're going to be working a lot with these people over the 3-4 years that you're going to be doing your PhD, so you want to be able to get along with them. It can really be a make or break in the PhD, so definitely worth chatting to them and seeing if not only the project is good for you, but supervisors good for you.
Awesome, great advice. Definitely, you want to make sure that you can work with the person that you're going to have to work very closely with for several years. Sally, you're next.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd echo what Ross and Liam have already said, but in terms of getting your CV and your personal statement ready to submit and send off, use your networks that you have existing as much as possible. So when I was kind of putting my CV and my personal statement together, I sent it to my master supervisor, I sent it to my manager and one of my colleagues at the research job that I was doing. I also sent it to some friends just to kind of get as broad a scope of feedback as I possibly could before sending off. So yeah, just make sure you're really, really happy with your CV and your personal statement before you send it off, and allow yourself more time than you think you need to write them, because especially with the personal statement, they can take a lot of time. So yeah, just
Definitely good advice, some that we should still follow now. Kilian, over to you.
Yeah, again, I can basically only agree on that. Like, let other people have a look on your application documents, especially if you're not native in English, for example. Look for typos. You don't want to submit a broken text. But also keep in mind, you might need to bring quite some documents at this stage of application or later if you're not native in English, or if your degree is not from a UK university. So keep that in mind to start that in time. And another thing, if you think that that project is, or that application is going into a good direction, you might be curious talking to existing PhD students with that supervisor for getting an impression of how it is to work with that person, not only yeah, from 5 minutes or half an hour of discussion you had prior to deciding for that.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Supervisors have different supervision styles, and some people you don't see for quite a while, some people you see really regularly, so it's worth thinking about what kind of would suit you and how you work. Over to you, Dorothea.
Yeah, I can only echo what has been said on CV and personalized statements. When it comes to the application submission, it sometimes is crucial to take into account that you need to submit reference letters as well, and they have to be submitted in time for the deadline. So give whoever you're asking the time to write them, and don't just ask them a week before submission deadline, because that will be a tense timeline for more senior academics. And when it comes to the CV, I can only recommend not throwing in the institution only, but actually fleshing out what you want to say. I know 2 pages are very tight, but you can get a narrative across on 2 pages. What do you want to say about your person, your background, and your attitude, how you approach a PhD, that you can flesh out by giving some minor hints for each experience that you've had. What did you do when you did the research internship? How did you do voluntary work? What did you do, and was it self-led? You can add some of these details to actually point the assessors to something that you want them to know.
Yeah, great point. Just for the SENSE CDT specifically for this year, references don't have to be in by the application deadline, because we had such a short recruitment phase this time. We started a bit later than everyone else, but it is typical that they need to be in before, and often the PhD cycle runs over Christmas and academics are on holiday, so it can be tricky. I was going to ask, so did everyone here apply for multiple PhDs? And if so, did you use the same application? Did you tailor it at all? There's nodding going on, so Ross.
Yeah, I applied for I think 3 different PhDs. 2 were very similar, but even with the similar ones, I didn't use the same application. I tried to tailor it as much as possible. And then the third one was quite different, and that was I wrote that totally from scratch. So I think that's really valid point, is that as much as you can, always try and tailor the application to that very specific project, and try and link up your experience and your skills to make it relevant to that project, rather than just applying for lots of projects with a sort of a more generic blanket statement.
Awesome. Everyone has their hand up. Brilliant. Dorothea, you're next on my screen.
Yeah, I can only say that sometimes it's worth applying several times for the same project. I applied for my PhD project that I had designed myself, but I didn't get it because it's quite a competitive process. And it's not just about whether you are a good fit for a project, but about funding and how it's distributed at a certain institution. So I didn't get it the first time, but I reapplied a year later and then got through. And in the meantime, in that year in between, I applied for other projects at other institutions as well. So in that regard, I think I can only encourage people not to get stuck when one thing doesn't work out. There are various pathways to interesting and worthwhile PhD.
Awesome. Liam, you're now in the top corner.
Awesome. Yeah, I did apply for a few. I applied for, I think, 3 PhDs, but I think it's worthwhile putting several applications in, especially if you find ones that you're interested in. Obviously, if you're really enthusiastic about one project, that can come across in your interview and make it more like you're gonna have a stronger application there. But I definitely tailor each application to the specific PhD. Don't just throw in generic ones. And yeah, I also know a lot of people who have applied twice and succeeded the second time or third time even. So and don't be disheartened if you don't get some the first time. You know, like, it's super competitive to get a PhD. So.
Yeah, it is. And if you don't know anyone that has a PhD, it's really hard to get your head around the application process itself. So the more you apply, the better you get. I applied for 6 odd PhDs when I did it. So it really varies. Sally, over to you.
Thanks. I applied for 2 different PhD projects, but they were both with the same supervisor. So the way that I found my PhD was that I found my supervisor first, really wanted to work with her, had a Zoom chat with her. She told me about the 2 projects that she was advertising. One of them was the SENSE CDT, the other one was the Panorama DTP project. They were both really similar, so my applications were quite similar. The CV was exactly the same. The personal statement I did tweak slightly, but because the projects were both very similar, I didn't have to change them very much. And I think it's worth saying that, so when I applied for my PhD, I was working in industry, and I knew I wanted to work with this supervisor at this institution on this kind of project. So I kind of thought, there's not really any point applying to another project just for the sake of it, because PhD applications often cost money to apply to as well. So there'll be a fee when you apply. So my thinking was, well, if I don't get either of the projects this time round, I'll carry on working in industry, gain more skills and experience, and I'll reapply to the same project if they're available next year. And as Heather and Liam both mentioned, your applications will be better the second time round, and you'll have new skills and experience to bring to the table. So yeah, luckily I got one of the projects, but if I hadn't I would have just applied for the following year.
Awesome, thank you. Kilian, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, same here. I also applied for several positions, and of course, tailored my applications, and I think I would definitely do that as well if I would apply again. But it is very competitive, so be prepared that you will not be offered all the positions you apply for. So you might apply for several positions you're interested. You can still cancel or not take the position in the end. That would be an option as well. And another thing about your references, depending on the project, you might want to bring different references. If you have a PhD with a case partner from industry, and for example, you did an internship in that field from a company which is somehow related, look that you can get a reference from them because it fits your project.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Do you think carefully about who you're asking to be your reference and whether you have experience outside of perhaps your degrees? I know several of the panelists today went into industry after masters or undergrad, and then come back to do PhD. I guess my next question is, how did you decide which PhD project was right for you? Sally.
Got there first.
Yeah.
I'd say firstly, have a think about the areas of research and the methodologies perhaps that you want to gain skills in, and go from there. And it's okay if you don't know, but having a think about what you might like to do potentially after your PhD, if you apply for one, can help guide you towards the right type of project. In terms of supervisors, I think the supervisor that you're working with makes a big difference to your all-round experience of your PhD in general and their supervision style. And people can have very different supervision styles depending on what kind of academic they are, whether they're an early career academic or whether they're a later stage academic who's been doing research for decades. And in terms of my own experience, to give an example, I was looking at projects to do with cryosphere science, so studying ice with 2 different supervisors. And the supervisor that I ended up going with is an early career academic, so she's a lot more kind of hands-on and very involved in my research. I meet with her weekly, and yeah, she's very involved in my work. And another project that I was considering applying for was with a later stage academic, and I had some advice from my master's supervisor at the time, who told me that often it's not always the case, but often later stage academics can be a little bit more hands off. They might not meet you quite as regularly. They might have other larger kind of projects going on with industry or their own companies or larger groups, so they have less time to invest in your project specifically. So yeah, I'd say be mindful of supervision style, and to echo what Liam was saying earlier, always have a chat with the supervisor before you apply to a project, because it's really important to kind of establish the kind of ground rules of what your relationship will be, how often they'll meet with you, how much time to expect from them. It's really important. So I'd say supervision makes a big difference.
Awesome. I'm going to hand to Ross, but I'm going to add B to the question. What do you do if your supervisor isn't very responsive, your prospective supervisor? You can answer the first question first to give you time to think.
Yeah, okay. So I would I'd echo what Sally said, and sort of I'll expand on that slightly as well. So yeah, I think one of the best things you can do is to sort of get an idea of what kind of supervision you're going to have and what that relationship with your supervisor will be, because it is different to sort of having a manager in a job, and you are sort of working independently quite a lot of the time. So if you're somebody that needs more contact and sort of you prefer to have more interaction, then that's something you should definitely look for. But I would also say to speak to members of the research group as well, so other PhD students. I think that's really important, and also you should hopefully, if you're at the point where you're sort of being offered a place, either you'll get an invite to come and visit the university or the research group, or if you ask to chat to some people, if they don't put you in contact with people, that's a bit of a red flag. So I've had people say that to me before, just basically look for a research group where everyone's willing to chat and let you know what it's like. I did, from my own experience, I did get an offer for a PhD project at a different university, and that they were all really nice, and they put me in contact with a current PhD student there, and I had a chat with them, and there was nothing bad at all, but I got the impression that the workload that was expected from me if I was to go there was sort of too high for what I was comfortable with. And there was talk of a lot of working weekends and things. And I thought that that's not really what I want to be doing. I'd like my weekends. And that did have a big influence. I decided not to take that project because of it, because I wanted to have a good work-life balance. So yeah, I think that's really important, just to be able to chat with everybody. And certainly in the project I'm doing now, I had a chance to speak to everybody in the research group beforehand. I got a really nice vibe, for lack of a better word, off everybody. And that's definitely been true as I've carried on working in the group. To answer part B of the question, if you try to make contact and not heard back, email again. Would be my first guess. A lot of academics, as Heather said, are just completely inundated with emails. I've sat and seen my supervisor's inbox just fill up in real time, and it's slightly terrifying. So it's not because they're not interested or don't want to speak to you. They probably really want to speak to you. They just haven't had a chance to sort of see your email and respond to it yet. So yeah, there's absolutely no harm in just sending a second follow-up. Equally, you could reach out to somebody else in the group and just ask if they're around for a chat, because you'd sort of like to hear what it's like working in that group and say that you're a prospective PhD student.
Yeah.
Yep. It's definitely been touched on a few times already, but contact the supervisor, talk to the supervisor. If you can't get in contact with them or they're not replying, look at their website or the profile, and it will say who they're supervising, and then you can contact the PhD students currently being supervised or previously being supervised by them and go and chat to them. And it's really good to get their opinion of how that supervision's been. Maybe even give better insight rather than just having a quick chat with them over Zoom, because you can't really get a full idea of what a person's like from a half an hour Zoom call or whatever it is. So that was the part B of the question. And then in terms of how did you decide which PhD is right for you? I went back to university after a while to do a master's in climate science, because that's what I sort of knew I wanted to do my PhD in that field. And then after that, I wanted to try and narrow down what I wanted to do for a PhD. But when you're deciding that, I guess it depends what PhDs are being advertised, what's out there, and then chatting to people. But you also want to pick something you're really enthusiastic about, and like know that you will be able to maintain that enthusiasm for 3 or 4 years, because you're going to be spending every day almost doing that field and working on that. And make sure like the methods and stuff that you're doing, so especially SENSE is very heavy on coding and using satellite data, so you want to kind of enjoy that in some way, shape or form, because otherwise it's going to be a bit of a miserable 3 or 4 years. Yeah.
We're aiming it not to be, to be clear.
We're all having a great time.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't, just to say for science, you don't have to have coding experience in the past. There's lots of training on it. But yeah, if it's something you absolutely hate and you're planning on applying for a SENSE application, definitely have a chat with the supervisor just to clarify what the setup will be. Over to you, Kilian.
Yeah, again, I can just say the same again. Talk to people to get a really good impression of your supervisor and the way the person is supervising or would be supervising you. But yeah, for me, it was also quite important what Liam just said. Make sure you're really passionate for what you're applying for, or the project you would be working in, because you will spend a lot of time, like even though we're in our first year, Liam and me, you will spend a lot of time reading papers, digging deeper into that project, and at the same time coding something, and you will just spend weeks and months and in the end years if you make it to your PhD on that project. So yeah, make sure that you're really excited in doing that.
Awesome, thank you. Dorothea?
I want to shed light onto a different aspect that I think is rarely or less talked about, and that is the place you're working in, the town, the city. The work is not the only part of life. At least I hope it is not. So I recommend taking into account the place you're going to move to. Is it a place you can imagine staying at for 3 to 4 years? and is there a life to build? And then it's something to take into account whether you are actually moving abroad, something that Kilian and I have done for our PhDs. And that is something to consider, whether you are willing to move away from your family, partner, what the distances are that you are able to cope with. It's definitely an additional challenge if you're having a long distance relationship, or if you're maintaining other caring responsibilities. So take that into account as well, because it's a life you're developing and not just a career to pursue.
So true, really good point. And it's something I think we should delve into deeper. So we've mentioned thinking about who you're going to work with and the place you're going to work with. What are some other things that you thought about before applying for a PhD? Not just the topic. So great, a lot of people on the call love ice, brilliant, we love it. But you are uplifting your life potentially to a whole different region. So what are the other bits that no one really talks about that you had to think about? I didn't send them this question to prepare, so I put them on the spot. Dorothea, you're right there again.
Yeah, for me, it's quite important to have a green city where I can move around cycling, just because that is an aspect of mobility. It is cheap when it comes to transport. I don't want to use a car for environmental reasons. So that is an aspect that was very strong for me, that the town is not too big. And in that regard, Cambridge is an absolute dream.
It is indeed. Liam, over to you.
Yeah, yes, I'm just kind of echoing what Dorothy has just been going on about. I chose Edinburgh partly because I love going up mountains, and that's also why I chose my PhD, because I love mountains and snow and winter mountaineering and climbing, and I wanted to be closer to the Scottish mountains. So that definitely played a big role in moving up to Edinburgh. And I knew that I would enjoy being there, because that would become more a part of my life. So definitely consider, your PhD isn't everything. There is life outside of PhD. So yeah, think about that too.
Awesome, Kilian.
Yeah, I can agree on that. Yeah, make sure you can really imagine living at that place for a couple of years where your PhD is based. But for me, it was also important thinking about the direction that PhD might send me, if it's like heavily research based or research focused, or if it might offer like a step into industry or possibly into other fields. If you think about climate, maybe more in the direction of policy making or NGOs. So yeah, that might be something to consider as well when deciding for a PhD, kind of connecting to the previous question.
Yeah, great point. Sally?
I'd just like to add, I've discussed supervisor relations, but I think trying to get a feel of the research group dynamic that you're joining is really important. So, for example, in my research group, we're all really great friends as well as colleagues. So that it's really nice to come into the office and see people that I really like spending time with every day. I also think it's a good idea to have a look at the department dynamics that you'll be joining. So I'm part of the Institute for Climate and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Leeds, and we have internal and external seminars every week. So all the PhD students in the department give an internal seminar once a year, and then once a week we have external speakers who work in climate science come in and give talks, and there are also lots of opportunities to do outreach in the department. So I think if you're considering the academically aligned stuff that aren't necessarily your PhD project, but that you'll still kind of do as part of your work, can really enrich your experience as a PhD student. And help your networking as well, for in terms of collaborations during your PhD, but also thinking about what you might like to do after your PhD, meeting external speakers from other universities and from research institutes and industry can be really useful. And then I'd also add, on the non-academic side, you are, as a PhD student, you're in this weird halfway house between being a student and being a member of staff, depending on whether you demonstrate or not. But demonstrating like assistant teaching on modules. It's called different things, different places. But because you are kind of technically a student, you can join university clubs and things. So I think in a similar way to undergrad, just checking what the opportunities are in terms of joining sports clubs or like party clubs or book clubs if you're into that kind of thing.
If you don't get enough reading in the day,
Yeah, exactly.
why not join a book club?
But yeah, if you're really keen on salsa dancing classes, make sure there's a salsa dancing opportunity for you, because that's a really life enriching thing to do.
Yeah, amazing, definitely. Ross?
Yeah, and I guess a slightly more boring but practical one. I think it's also just touching on what Dorothy was saying about thinking about where you want to live. It's also just worth having consideration of what the cost of living is like in different cities and different places, because everybody, if you're funded by UKRI, everyone receives the same stipend in the UK unless you live in London, and that goes further in different places. So it's just something that's worth considering, particularly, for example, if you have any dependents or anyone else who sort of you're responsible for it. That's worth considering. I
Yeah.
guess sort of childcare and things like that, if that's something that you need to factor in.
Yeah, definitely a good point. I think the general message is look for a project that interests you, but make sure you can see yourself living there, which is very key. We've had a question in the chat asking if SENSE PhD students are expected to teach any classes. It's almost mandatory at my home uni. So I will pass to any SENSE student that puts their hand up. Otherwise I can answer. Ross, there we go.
Yeah, you're not expected to teach any classes. So it's optional, and you get paid to do the sort of the teaching and demonstrating. You generally would put in a very short application to demonstrate on a specific module, and certainly that's how it works at Leeds. I think it's probably similar to Edinburgh. I guess Leam can speak to that. But yeah, there's no obligation to do it. That's not part of your contract. But you are able to demonstrate and to gain experience doing that. But there's a limit on the number of hours that you can work for the university per year. But I think that's in the order of sort of 200 or thereabouts. So it's, well, I guess it's probably not that easy to make 200, but I'm not too sure.
I've never heard of anyone going anywhere near that, but you know, you might prove us wrong. Who knows? Liam?
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely not mandatory. It's optional, but you do get paid for it. So a little bit of extra money can be nice. I would say it can be really nice to try and teach people and can give you a bit of a boost, because sometimes you feel like you don't know anything. And then you go and teach people and suddenly you're like, oh, I can actually help. So that can be kind of reassuring a little bit. But yeah, don't bite off more than you can chew. Like you still need to do your PhD and any other outreach or other stuff that you want to do in the meantime. And you need to live your life. So yeah, I think Edinburgh recommends about no more than 9 hours a week on teaching and demonstrating. I at the moment only do like 4 hours every other week, so that's more than enough for me.
Yeah, awesome. You can also do demonstrating on at Leeds anyway, on like field courses and stuff, so you can go and walk around the Lake District with some undergrads, which is always like a nice little excursion. I believe, and I would have to check this, that at Bath, British Antarctic Survey, so if you're based at Bath, even though you're registered at Leeds, you can demonstrate at Leeds, but you'd have to come up to Leeds to do that teaching. So just be aware of that. It's worth checking with your specific project supervisor if you're based at one of our partner institutions, not essentially at universities, to just double check that. Where do PhD students generally live? Dorms, shared flats, private flats, especially in Edinburgh. So Liam, a lot of pressure on you here. Would you like someone else to go first?
I can go first if you want, yeah. Oh,
That's okay.
Yeah, I live in a flat with 2 other PhD students. I didn't know them before I moved there, but I've been very lucky in that my master's supervisor emailed around and found some people who also like climbing and outdoorsy stuff, so I ended up living with them and it's worked out very well. But also, yeah, so generally just a private flat is what I'm in, and I think that's what most of my friends in Edinburgh are based in. But just to comment on housing in Edinburgh, can be really hard to get, so if you are looking at Edinburgh, I'd definitely start looking earlier than I did, because you end up panicking and rushing and trying to find something, and it's worth going up there in person and checking them out first for sure.
Dorothea.
So when I moved, it was still the time of the pandemic, and it was hard to assess what was possible, when to move, where to move. I got the chance to connect with some other PhD students already in Cambridge, and to visit their house as a virtual visit. So I can recommend doing that if you don't have the chance to go to a place before you move there. But I definitely recommend checking out the place in some way, because you don't want to spend money on something that is actually fake. And then I can recommend moving together with other PhD students because they're at a similar stage of life. We're in a shared house, but we don't actually work on the same subject. So I think it can be nice to live with people that don't exactly do what you do, so that work doesn't become an overwhelming aspect of your leisure time as well. And when it comes to the options of what is nice to have in terms of housing, I definitely profited from a garden. I know it's an absolute luxury, but during the pandemic, it has taught me a lot about what we need to recharge, and some access to a green space can be really helpful for your mental health. And you're going through ups and downs during a PhD. So definitely keep in mind whether there's maybe even a park if it's not your own garden, because that is obviously expensive. And checking early is really helpful as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to make another comment because I didn't cover everything in that question. And I said that everyone I know is in private accommodation, which is not true. I do know a lot of PhD students actually in their first year go into shared flats and uni dorms, because there's like often postgraduate halls, so you can be with other PhD students and master's students. Maybe for your first year whilst you're getting to know people and getting to grips with the place, and then go and move out into private flats in second year. And yeah, be in shooting distance of the office, because unless you want to work from home all the time, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. And one final thing, yeah, touching on what Dorothea said, it's nice to have PhD students around you to share that sort of experience with, but also you want to hang out with people necessarily who aren't doing PhDs as well, because there is a wider world out there outside of academia, and you can become very channel focused on that, and it can become a bit much.
Yeah, definitely, good point. Sally?
So at Leeds there are postgrad halls as well, and I think they have specific international halls if you're an international student looking for accommodation, so that provision is there for you if you want to choose that option. But as Heather mentioned in her introduction, one of the great things about the SENSE CDT is that you're all introduced on Slack before you start your PhD. So there's a channel where everybody new is added, and you introduce yourselves and people say hi, and then usually, or in the case of our year, there were 7 of us who were all moving to Leeds, who all wanted to live in shared housing. So we all sent messages along the lines of, I'm also moving to Leeds, if anyone wants to look for a house, hit me up. And then we all started a group chat. We had a big Zoom call with 7 of us. We ended up splitting into 2 groups and getting 2 houses, and we lived in the SENSE houses in our first year. And it was just a really fantastic avenue to have to meet other people who were also moving around the same time frame. So that's one of the great things about the SENSE CDT.
And often there's multiple CDTs or DTPs, PhD cohorts essentially that start at the same time. So you can look for other areas, and often universities have like newsletters or things where you can put, I'm looking to share a house with. some new PhDs, etc. So make sure you reach out if that's something you're keen for. Dorothea? Oh, sorry, Sally.
Just final point. If you really don't know where to look or where to start, email your supervisor and they will be able to point you towards either different people to email or different avenues to look for. So don't worry and don't stress. You'll find some after it. It will be okay.
Great. Sorry for cutting you off there. Dorothea.
I thought I'd just add that when it comes to Cambridge and the C-Clear DTP, that you have the opportunity to mention 2 colleges that you would like to be affiliated with for your PhD, because you're not just affiliated with the university, but also a college. And when it comes to the selection of a college, the postgrad accommodation is actually a factor you can take into account, because that differs widely among the colleges. There are more than 30 colleges, and I actually did take the time to look through their websites and what the accommodation is like. And some immediately dropped out because they were far out of town or only had very pricey accommodation. There are big differences. So I can recommend looking up the different colleges and what opportunities they have for you.
Awesome, thank you. Kathy, our SENSE co-director, has joined us. It's up to you whether you want to put your camera on. We've got some specific application questions that I think would be great to get your input, and also the panelists from the student perspective and being the interviewee. We'll start with, is it necessary to have technical experience for earth sciences based research for admission?
No, not at all. I mean, a lot of people applying will not be doing that. We've got a very broad cohort of people coming in with a variety of degrees. And I mean, most people are unlikely to have been exposed to that. Some master's courses will have involved it, but it's certainly not a requirement at all.
Awesome, thank you. Does anyone here have an? I think we've got a mixed background of degrees and things, Liam.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about SENSE is you actually have so many people from so many different backgrounds, and that's it's such an interdisciplinary field of just using, and uses a lot of different skills. So like, I'm from a physics background. I did physics undergraduate. I think quite a few people going in have done physics, because it can be really helpful for understanding the remote sensing techniques and being able to apply that in environmental science. I also know one of my friends in Edinburgh who's just started as well, is computer science background, and he's heavily leaning on the machine learning, but he hasn't done anything in earth science before, no environmental science. So yeah, any sort of background really.
Sally?
This might sound a bit cheesy, so apologies. But in terms of your applications and interviews, what people are really looking for often is enthusiasm. You can teach skills and you can give people training, but you can't teach enthusiasm. So if you have a passion for the subject that you want to study, and you can demonstrate that you have the background which can support you in learning the correct skills in order to study, that's all you need. So not all you need, but it's a big factor.
Awesome, thank you. Dorothea?
I'm not sure whether that is something that is essential. I don't think so. But showing that you have research background can be really helpful, at least in Cambridge. So I had in the year that it took from the first application to the second, I actually turned my bachelor thesis into a first peer-reviewed article, and taking that into the second round and showing that you actually know how to write a paper was a real luxury. I know it's not a must-have, but it shows that you are actually already delving into the process of what an academic life is.
Kathy?
Yeah, I would very much echo that. I mean, not necessarily to have gone to the extent of having a peer-reviewed article published, but certainly one of the things that we're looking for in applications is either some evidence for research capacity that can be from an undergraduate project or work, you know, an internship or something like that, or I mean, actually, I should say, and it is something that we try to assess at interview as well. Just, I mean, and it doesn't need to be research in an area that's at all relevant to your application. It can be in something really quite different that you've been exposed to earlier, but just be able to see that you've got the what it takes to, as far as we can tell, to do research is really important.
Amazing, thank you, Liam.
Yeah, just one more thing might have been mentioned already, but like what makes SENSE quite unique, I guess, is the amount of training that you do receive, especially in your first year. So because of that, you can come in from a different background and get to grips with it in your first year and soon become an expert and be able to carry out your PhD in a field you've never really gone into before.
Very true. And I'm just having a quick read of...
Yeah.
Oh, Kathy, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to add, I mean, my own experience, I think, is pertinent here. So I did a physics, in fact, I did a mathematical physics degree because I was so useless in the lab that I just decided that staying out of the lab was best for everyone. And then I moved into doing geophysics, you know, for my PhD, and it wasn't a subject I knew or anything like that, but I just found that a lot of the courses had either direct or transferable skills in them that I could bring to my PhD. And I'm sure that would be true for a lot of people coming into a SENSE or even another DTP that's NERC funded, often have not got the direct experience, but have got lots and lots of skills and experience and research capability demonstrable that makes them good for a PhD.
Very true. Slightly, it's a similar question. Are the accepted PhD students expected to have a high proficiency of the methodology, or can we have a basic understanding? And what are the supervisors and recruitment team looking for in your profile?
I would say you don't have to have high capacity. That's part of what we're aiming to deliver with training, although the training is much broader than any one PhD project within SENSE would use. So you're going to have to be trained in things that to some extent you'll never use, but certainly will enable you to have more meaningful conversations with the rest of the cohort to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it and why it's important. And I've forgotten what the second half of the question was.
What are the key things you're looking for in someone's profile when they're applying?
I mean, the basic skills, you know, the background that would be necessary, which is often, you know, sufficient maths, a degree in a relevant subject, or equivalent qualifications for people coming in non-traditional paths. Remind me if I forget to say that in the answer to anything else, Heather, where I'm just assuming that people are going to come through the normal route, and we don't expect people to come through the normal route. We very much welcome applications from non-traditional route students as well. So and as I was saying earlier, some demonstrated or indicative capacity for doing research, as I think it was Dorothea said, somebody said earlier, the enthusiasm, to demonstrate the enthusiasm for what you're going to be working on, even if you're not exactly sure of the details. You know, I'm excited to be joining this program because I'm going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And obviously that shouldn't be fanciful, you know, I'm going to solve all the problems of the world and answer all the sustainable development goals. But I mean, if you've got some kind of driving force behind you that it makes you think that the SENSE PhD would be for you, or for whatever PhD you're applying for. And I realise that most people will apply for way more than one PhD, and that's perfectly understood. But just to be able to demonstrate, you know, why you think you can do it and why you want to do it, I would say are two key things. And obviously include in your application any relevant information that goes with that demonstration. But I would say that less can be more. Don't make your application too listy. Make sure that all the key things that we're asking for is there, and just use a few extra words to formulate something more clearly rather than add something else to the list, I would say.
Yeah, really great. We had a little chat about coming from alternative routes, as we call it, having a break in industry or different designs already, and it's definitely encouraged. Sally, you're in my top left corner.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a note on whether or not you need to know or be proficient in the methodology for your project already. Absolutely not. And I'd say most PhD students spend at least the first 6 months of their projects learning how to do the methodology. And as Kathy mentioned, with the SENSE CDT, you have the SENSE training as well. So you also have an opportunity to learn auxiliary methodologies as well. In some cases, people do a master's project with a supervisor, and then they will continue that project as a PhD. So in those few cases, those people might understand some intricacies of the methodology they will be using, but I'd say it's much more common for you not to have an idea about how to do something. And often if you don't know what the methodology entails, it's usually, well, it could be a better scenario because you spent time doing other research, and there might be aspects that you can apply to a new methodology that somebody who had done something completely different wouldn't even think of. So it may be that you're a more well-rounded researcher if you've spent time conducting research using different methodologies rather than the one that your project is specifically going to be using in the future.
Definitely. I know a lot of us still draw on things that potentially we just touched on at undergrad or in our masters or in industry, and it really does help to develop you as a researcher. Liam?
I might be touching on something that could be coming up soon, but I definitely think going into your interview, it's important to be able to explain the project that you're applying for in your own words, not just listing off what it says on the website or wherever it's advertised, and be able to explain the aims and the methods that you might use to go about it. But obviously you're not expected to be an expert in the field at all. You're not expected to know how to apply this or like carry out your research. That's the whole point of doing research. You're going to learn and do that. And it's the whole process of a PhD. A PhD is a training program at the end of the day.
Definitely. If you had all the skills at the start, you probably shouldn't be doing the PhD. And knowledge, anyway. Let's have another look at the chat. Oh, we lost Kilian. No, you're in the middle. There you are. I'm directing a question straight at you, Kilian. I hope that's okay. How does the buddy system work, and settling in a foreign country can be especially hard for an international student? I'll cover the buddy system because we're working on developing it. Well, I am even more. Basically, we connect you with an existing student, so you can ask all your questions. And I know before I started, I had many things like, where shouldn't I live? Where's the very undergraduate studenty place that I don't want to live in, etc., etc. But Kilian, can you give us an international student perspective?
Yeah, sure. I would also mention the buddy program because I actually also registered, and I think it's a really nice thing for connecting to local students. Beyond that, there's quite some clubs at university. There's a global cafe, they call it, like an international meetup every Monday, where you will meet a lot of people who are very interested in meeting other people who are not from Leeds, not locals, which is quite nice for socializing, for getting to know people. For me, it was new that there are so many clubs, but apparently that's a very UK thing. So as we're technically students, as PhD students, you can go to all those clubs, depending on your interests, hiking, whatever, climbing, and you will meet a lot of people. I didn't find it hard at all to start here in terms of socializing. What was a bit more annoying was all the paperwork which you need to do for coming here. So even if you're from an EU country, you will need a visa. You will need to provide documents to prove your skill of speaking English, basically. So just having studied a master's in English in a non-English speaking country is not enough. So those things were a bit annoying, but in general, it wasn't that bad, I would say.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are added forms for international students, but if you do have any questions, please email SENSE Recruitment. A lot of it comes from directives from the university, so it's out of our control, unfortunately, but we're here to support you if you have any questions. Oh, there's an Edinburgh question again, Liam. Are you ready?
So ready.
The usual funding for a UK-based PhD is around 17k. Is it enough for a comfortable life in Edinburgh? I am a minimalist. Gosh, that's a difficult word to say. But love a peaceful environment.
I also love a peaceful environment. I think my flat, I've been very lucky and found a flat that's with 2 housemates who are very relaxed as well. And it's been a very chilled environment. I think some people aren't maybe as lucky, so it's always luck of the draw moving to a new city and finding new people to live with. But definitely, hopefully by the second year, you know, like sort of people you're looking for, or if you're just looking for a place on your own. I do know some of the people in SENSE who are in their first year are living in flats on their own. So it is enough to live in a flat on your own, even if it's a bit tight. Edinburgh's quite an expensive city, so you're not going to be making loads of money, but I don't think anyone who's signing up to do a PhD is aiming at making a lot of money particularly.
Straight away, anyway.
Straight away.
So the stipend amount is set by the UKRI. It has recently been raised around 10% in line with inflation after a campaign by PhD students. So unfortunately, we can't change that too much. Kathy?
Yes, I was just going to comment that a lot of the PhD students end up doing some tutoring and demonstrating, which is a small additional income, untaxed. So, I mean, the amount that a student will do varies from place to place, student to student. Obviously, if you've got field work or a campaign going on, it makes it harder to do that. But it is a way of adding a little bit to the stipend to make life a little bit more comfortable. I mean, it is true that Edinburgh is a more expensive city than, say, Leeds, but even in Edinburgh, our students survive on their stipend, I would say.
Dorothea?
It's not my own experience, but I can speak from somebody here in my research group who has caring responsibilities, and they are living with that stipend, and it's a tight budget. It's definitely very tight. That is to take into account the issues faced by people who have caring responsibilities. So when it comes to that, if that is something you have to keep in mind, the tutoring or demonstrating is definitely essential. Yeah,
great, thank you. Is the intake of October 2023 a strict timeline, or is it possible to start, say, in January or perhaps virtually in October? Kathy, I'm directing this one at you. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, no, I noticed that in the chat, and I just was wanting to wait for us. Well, yes, it is fixed. We can't take late starts except for exceptional reasons. So this year we do have somebody doing a late start, but that's because we had somebody who was unable to take up their position. So we didn't do the enrolment until the summer, and that just meant that a January start was the earliest they could do. And that's partly for cohort building, and it's partly for training as well. So there's quite a bit of training that takes place before Christmas. So it just would not be very practicable to start, and starting remotely is not really very practicable either. And I don't think it's possible even for an overseas student. It's extremely unlikely that we would accept anybody for other than an October start.
Dorothea?
This is probably a point where the C-Clear DTP differs from the SENSE CDT, because I started in January. I deferred by a term because I had a previous project that I wanted to finish until December 2020, 2019, sorry. And then that made a big difference for how I felt about the start of the PhD. And yeah, it definitely is something to consider. And I can add as well that even though I wanted to start in person and I moved in time, the alpha wave led to me being at home when it hit. And then I studied from home for 5 months and did the PhD virtually. It has obviously impacted what I did during that first 5 months because lab work at home was literally impossible for an ice core scientist. But yeah, it led to me adding a literature review to my PhD project, which yeah, then might be a change that you need to make to the project in order to take it up later.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So SENSE kind of runs in the UKRI recruitment system, whereby applications have to be in January and then there's interviews, etc. But there's also a question in chat about being on a project or CDT or DTP PhD versus an independent PhD. I'm on an independent PhD and I actually started mine out of the usual cycle in June. And it has positives and negatives for both of the options, unfortunately. I don't get the cohort feel that SENSE get and is really worked on by SENSE, and the students are great at developing it themselves, which is amazing. And I've just seen a bunch more questions appear, so I'll have a quick look. How does having a published paper, how much of an impact does that have or a boost on your application? Kathy, I think that one's for you potentially.
Yeah, no, I would say that's a very positive thing because I mean that's a very, very clear indication of research capability, and it's actually demonstrating a really, really useful skill because some people are good at the actual research, but they're not so good at writing it up. And so to have gone through the whole process from doing the research, getting the results, analysing and interpreting them, but then also to be able to write a journal paper is actually, you know, it's a really, really, it's a huge achievement, especially for somebody to do it pre-PhD. So that's very much a positive. I mean, I would say if you don't have that, don't be put off applying. It's a very rare phenomenon, but it does mean that somebody's already, it's a box that basically we can tick. We know that they have the capacity to do the research right through from start to the publishing. So yeah. It's a very good thing to have, but it's a nice to have, not an essential.
Yeah, definitely. And Dorothea, as the rare phenomenon who published before PhD.
Yeah, I only published pre-PhD because I had to reapply for the PhD. But yeah, so something that I can say is that having that paper out there actually gave me a massive self-confidence boost when I entered that interview, because I knew, okay, I've done this once, I probably can do it another time. And that's quite helpful to know before you enter a PhD. And it has given me confidence when I now am writing papers, because I have the peer review process can be quite something that can be really rough, and people are put off by the typical reviewer too, who's very harsh, and you can't meet that requirement that they are putting you through. And knowing that you are actually surviving that, even though it feels like it's killing your paper, killing your research, it has given me the confidence that the process of communicating my research, I can actually do that. So I know the very first paper is always the hardest, and knowing that you've done it is actually, it's not just for who is assessing you, but for you, that you know I can do this.
That's great, thank you. Ross?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to second that, because I did similar between finishing my undergrad, my integrated master's, and then in the year that I was applying for PhDs, I wrote up my master's project into paper. But I just wanted to say that if you have a project that you've done with a supervisor for your undergrad or your master's, and it's something that you've enjoyed and you think it might be worth seeing if you'd write it up, it's worth asking your supervisor whether you could do a summer placement with them or something. They might have some extra funding, and it's good experience, and it will definitely serve you well. Because that's what I did, and I think it was really useful.
Next question: are we allowed to apply if we already have a PhD degree? Kathy.
We do not accept students who already have a PhD, so not onto SENSE anyway. Just incredibly occasionally, somebody who's got a very unrelated degree and suddenly seen the light and decided that something in the earth or environment area is for them, have gone on to do a second PhD, but it's incredibly rare, and there has to be an incredibly good, clear case for it, why the one PhD is not sufficient. So if you already have one and want to apply, you need to explain yourself really, really well in the application process.
That's great. We're coming towards the end, and I just want to ask our panelists one final thing. We'll start with what's the worst thing about PhD, and then we'll finish with the positive. What's the best thing? Sally, over to you.
So sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming, especially as you're likely to be an incredibly driven person if you're applying for a PhD in the first place. Having perfectionist personality traits can make it difficult to avoid burnout, but it's really important to try and find a balance as early on as you possibly can. So make sure you take your evenings and your weekends off, and take your holidays, and be really strict about it. And also be honest and reach out if you need help. Reach out to your supervisors, reach out to your colleagues in your research group, but there will also be specific people based at whatever institution you're at that you can reach out to, who aren't your supervisor if you don't feel comfortable discussing it with them, if you need help. And usually university-wide, there are also services that exist specifically to help PhD students with issues, whether you have mental health issues or financial issues or anything. So yeah, it can be overwhelming, but being honest and reaching out for help when you need it is my advice for that.
Positive side.
Yeah, it will be okay.
Ross, you?
Yeah.
You happy?
Yeah, I think Sally makes a really good point there. And there's definitely times when I've sort of not times when I've not known the direction I was going to go in. And when you're trying to figure that out, it kind of feels like you're struggling a bit for direction. But that's part of the process, and sort of coming to develop your research questions and direction of research. Once you've realized where you want to go, it's really rewarding, because the PhD gives a sort of unique, a complete unique opportunity to just work on something that you really, really, really are interested in and you love working on. And there's not really anybody externally telling you, oh, you need to do this different thing. So it's not like you're working in a job where you're just sort of fulfilling tasks that are given down by somebody higher up, but you're working with your supervisor to sort of to do some research that nobody else in the world is probably doing exactly the same as you. And it's just a really rewarding experience in that respect.
Amazing. Kilian?
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar for me. So you will spend a lot of time on your project, and you will try out a lot of things, and not everything works. And maybe especially in the beginning, you might get stuck with some stuff, and you might need some guidance which you didn't expect, and so on. But at the same time, you're very free to do what you're doing. Like you're free to develop your own method. You're free to read this or to read that paper to extend your knowledge in this and that direction. If it helps you in the end with your PhD, it's all fine. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse at the same time.
Great. Liam?
Yeah, sort of Kilian touched on it a bit, but like the best and the worst thing, I think, for me is the fact you've got so much freedom to do with what you will with your time all the time. And if you're not used to that, like being able to plan out your time wisely and ensure you're like leaving work at work and like setting boundaries for yourself. I think there's not many other jobs where you're so personally invested in what you're doing, and it's so hard just to leave it when you're coming home, you know. And yeah, I think it's a lot of working on your own, whereas like maybe in industry and other jobs you're always working and interacting with other people. So I think trying to make the most of those opportunities that you do have to collaborate and chat with other people is really important. So yeah, making sure you don't isolate yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And I think SENSE, from my opinion, the SENSE cohorts is great because you work with a group of people who use remote sensing. So you all have something in common and you've all been on the training. So talking to someone not in your specific research group, but who can understand what you're talking about, is a really great atmosphere. Kathy?
I was partly triggered by earlier comments that I think most of my PhD students, I'm not talking SENSE, I'm talking PhD students over decades, and even going to back to my own experience, have a period when you would say they've got the blues. So I had the second year blues, and I think the second year blues is a very, very common phenomenon. Most of my students have had second year blues, and I remember one who didn't. I thought, good gracious, X has not had the second year blues, and then they had the third year blues instead. But I mean, I think one of the things that you'll learn as a PhD student is when to ask for help. You know, when have you beaten your head against a brick wall enough? And you'll also learn who to ask. You know, you can start off just by asking your cohort and then go to your supervisor, or maybe you just, in some circumstances, going to straight to your supervisor is the right thing to do. And there's no such thing in my book as a stupid question, right? So if you want to ask a question, there's a reason for it, and therefore it can't by definition be stupid. So, I mean, sometimes you do silly things. We've all done silly things. I've done plenty of my own, particularly coding things. So, I mean, don't be frightened of that. And I was just thinking back to my own experience. I had the second year blues because I was kind of flapping around aimlessly. I wasn't really doing anything. I wasn't getting anywhere. I wasn't making any progress. And then at the start of my third year, I had what seemed to me like a good idea. And so I trailed it around and everybody agreed, yes, it was a good idea. And I found that because of what I'd done in my first 2 years, I had lots of skills so I could really crack on with this good idea so quickly and get results really, really fast. And it was incredibly fulfilling and incredibly productive. And I think about it, if I'd had that good of an idea in first year, A, I probably wouldn't have had it anyway, but B, I probably wouldn't have recognised it as a good idea. So just part of the process that you go through with all the times when you think it's not going so well, you're still learning things, you're still building on experience, you're still building experience which you can bring to bear later on in your PhD as well. So that's my own experience, and also looking back over, you know, a few, you can see my hair, you know, I'm not young, a few decades of supervising students myself as well.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think we've all been staring at code when the bug is just a space somewhere that there shouldn't be. Dorothea, why didn't you finish this up?
Yeah, so I thought I'd give some examples of what can go wrong in the second year. Catching COVID on day one of the biggest conference of your PhD, you trying for a year to ship your samples, and then your final flight is cancelled and you have to return home for lab work. There are so many things that you're going to encounter that you can't plan. And for people, I think Selley said it, who are driven and who want to pursue goals and set plans, this is sometimes a real nightmare to face life and the lack of control that you have and facing all the issues. So I think the hardest bit is coming to terms with that things will go wrong. You will have to change your path through this PhD is the hardest bit. And that I think Liam said that the freedom is a blessing and a curse. So when I'm now changing the direction of my PhD because certain things have not worked out, there's also the blessing that I can actually forge some new skills that I might not have expanded with the original plan. And I think for me, one of the key goals of the PhD is not just to get a degree, have that career goal, but who am I becoming in the process? So even though I didn't like the flight cancellation, it's a chance to actually develop a character skill, and that is facing the challenge and going forward nevertheless, and develop some personal skills that will propel us forward beyond the PhD.
Definitely. I think PhDs are great for developing transferable skills, as they like to say. You learn a lot of ways to deal with frustration, you learn lots of technical skills, but things like project management, teaching, outreach, so much. And we're going to round it up now. And I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Kathy, for coming along to answer the technical questions. I've put some links in the chat, and I've also linked a very, very quick, I promise it's quick, feedback form just to see whether this event was helpful and how we could improve it in the future. And there's also a box for you to say, keep me on the mailing list so we update you with where we are with the applications, etc. So thank you so much for attending. And if there are any more questions, please email Sense Recruitment, the email's in the chat. And don't hesitate to reach out. As Kathy says, there's no such thing as a silly question. If you're worrying about it, do email that email address or your supervisor. The Sense Recruitment email address, as I said earlier, is only monitored by myself and the centre managers, so not anyone that's involved in reviewing your application and judging whether to put you forward for a project, etc. So it's completely independent of that. So if you're worried about anything affecting your application, it won't if you ask the question to that email address. So awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll say goodbye.